This text is a summary of the dialogue to the first part of the webinar training for the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit Vaccine Effectiveness Project, presented at the 2011 PALISI Conference event in September. The summary begins with 4 introductory slides presented by Dr. Lauren Olshow, the Abt Associates Project Director for the Vaccine Effectiveness Project. The summary continues with the first 12 slides presented by Dr. Adrienne Randolph, Director of the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit Vaccine Effectiveness Project Coordinating Center at Children's Hospital, Boston. Slide 1, cover page. We begin the presentation with a welcome and introduction from Lauren Olshow, the Abt Project Director for the Vaccine Effectiveness Project. Slide 2 is the agenda, in which Dr. Olshow continues with a review of the agenda, which includes an overview of the PICUVE project, a discussion of the community controls, vaccine verification process, and data transfer procedures. Following a break, an overview of IRB requirements and HIPAA procedures will be conducted. Finally, we'll wrap up the training with a question and answer session. Slide 3 is a discussion of study partners. Dr. Olshow also wanted to note and identify numerous partners who are involved with the project and what role they serve. Slide 4 is a review of tags, which are new to this project. New to the training this year is the use of smartphone tags throughout the training manual. Should anyone wish more information related to topics addressed within this presentation, you may download all necessary apps and use the tags to be redirected to the appropriate content web page. This concludes the 4-slide introduction. The next section is an overview of the Influenza Vaccine Effectiveness for High-Risk Children project.
This is presented on behalf of the PALISI Investigators PICUVE Study Group. And as we all know, influenza infection is an important cause of morbidity and mortality in children, and there are multiple underlying conditions contributing to increased risk for influenza complications, including neurologic, pulmonary, cardiac conditions, as well as immune compromise. And the Committee on Immunization Practices from the CDC recommends for all children 6 months of age and over an annual flu vaccine. There is not a vaccine available for children less than 6 months of age. Most studies on vaccine effectiveness, however, have been done in healthy children, despite the fact that most of the patients who end up in the ICU, at least 60% of them have some underlying condition, and we don't know how well they're responding to the vaccination. Possibly they need more than one vaccination a year. So our primary study aim is to evaluate the effectiveness of influenza vaccination during the 2010-11 and the 2011-12 influenza seasons in preventing laboratory-confirmed influenza infection associated with admission to the pediatric ICU in children 6 months to 17 years of age. Secondarily, we want to identify factors that may mitigate the course and severity of outcomes among vaccinated and unvaccinated children. We want to identify non-influenza sources of infection and co-infection in ICU patients and their influence on outcomes. And we want to assess the sensitivity and specificity of alternative sites of specimen collection and methods for detection of influenza and other pathogens. Sorry about that. I'm clicking for my slides to advance and they're not advancing. Here we go. So this is a case control study design with 2 sets of controls. The cases are ICU enrollees with influenza confirmed by Marshfield real-time PCR. Our target number of enrollees is 125, and that's decreased from the 160 that we had previously targeted. However, we do think that the 125 should give us a sufficient sample size to do the case control study. And then we have 2 types of controls. We have the ICU controls, who are patients who met criteria. They have influenza-like illness. They're admitted to the ICU. but their test was negative for influenza. And then we have these community controls where we're enrolling them 2-to-1 controls to the case, who are patients who've received medical services at a PALISI site or affiliated clinics in the last 24 months at an institution in the same influenza region as the enrolled ICU patient. So because we're targeting 125 cases that are influenza positive, we need 250 controls. So the number of eligible patients that we have to enroll to reach these 125 cases depends on the prevalence of influenza. If 10% of those with influenza-like illness meet criteria, then we have to enroll 1,250 patients. That means that many have to be tested and Marshfield PCR tested, consented, and enrolled in order to get our 125. If the prevalence of influenza is higher than that, if it's close to 25%, we need to enroll 500 patients. Last year, of those we tested, the prevalence was at 25%. However, for some of the time, we only had people enroll when there was evidence from other testing sources that the patient had influenza. So that may be a little bit inflated. We think that probably our prevalence will be somewhere between 10 and 25%. We anticipate that there will be at each of the PALISI sites about 350 to 850 patients with influenza-like illness screened at each of those sites to reach our target. So the criteria for starting enrollment at each site will begin the week in which there are 2 or more positive laboratory tests for influenza by a method other than commercially available rapid antigen detection tests in a laboratory associated with the enrolling hospital. So you start seeing evidence of influenza in the emergency department or somewhere in the community at an affiliated hospital. Or there were 2 or more previous weeks of local laboratory data indicating an increased proportion of tests are positive for influenza. ICU enrollment will begin when the criteria for influenza season is met, and it will continue until one of the following. There's 125 influenza cases. We reach our target. That's what our hope is. Hopefully it's not limited by our budget. However, our budget is very limited because we are in an extension period with the budget. Or the end date, the final termination date, no matter what, as far as enrollment, is May 31st, 2012. So you're not really allowed to start enrollment at your site until we've had a discussion and we approve that you go ahead and start enrollment. But once you see any influenza activity, you need to let us know, and we'll be checking with you frequently to determine when you see influenza activity in your area. So this is the ICU screening and enrollment algorithm. And basically, here's the patient who's symptomatic for severe acute viral infection, has symptoms of lower respiratory tract infection or shock requiring vasopressors with antibiotics, so they can get septic shock, or central nervous system dysfunction plus fever and cough or sore throat, or an acute increase in respiratory support. If they don't have any of those, if they don't meet any of those 4 categories, then they're ineligible. And that rules out most of the patients when you screen who are not eligible will drop out there. If they're under 6 months of age or 18 or over, they're ineligible. If they don't reside in the catchment area, they're ineligible. Because our catchment areas are pretty broad, that's usually not a common reason for them not being eligible. Can you collect the specimen within 7 days of illness onset? And that, if, for example, the patient's already been sick for a week and the parent's not available until 2 or 3 days from then the patient would not be eligible. But if that ends up being a reason for not being eligible, please call us to discuss because that one criteria is a little bit hard to interpret sometimes. We do need the parent or legal guardian to speak English or Spanish, but only one parent has to be able to speak English or Spanish. And that is because our community controls also, that is one of the requirements. The only real categories that patient underlying conditions that we're not including are patients awaiting a lung transplant and patients who have chronic mechanical ventilator support for neuromuscular weakness or chronic respiratory failure. And the reason, and this would be round-the-clock ventilator support. And the reason for this is because it's hard to match controls to those kinds of patients who have very, very high risk of having influenza-related complications. If the infection is considered to be nosocomial or hospital-acquired according to your infection control at your hospital, then we do not enroll that patient. And we are not enrolling pregnant teens. And the reason is because we have a whole nother study focused on pregnant women with adequate numbers of pregnant women. So, so we decided not to enroll the very few numbers of pregnant adolescents who happen to be in the ICU. So the ICU enrollment flow diagram here is that the patient meets criteria, and you go ahead and enroll them and test them using the Marshfield. You collect the swabs, and we'll go over what to send for the test in a minute, but we send our laboratory samples to Marshfield, where they do a very sensitive and specific CDC-approved PCR-based test for influenza. And if that test is positive, we consider it to be a confirmed case. If that test is positive, and even if the tests at the local site were negative, we still consider it a confirmed case, because this is a more sensitive test than the ones that are commercially available, usually at most of the sites. So basically, anytime that test is positive, we consider that to be a real case of flu. Now, if the Marshfield test is negative, and all the tests for flu at the site were negative, then we consider that our PCR negative control, ICU control. However, if that Marshfield PCR test is negative, but there's clinical tests at the site that are positive, then we consider it a suspected case, and we don't use it as a control, and we also don't consider it to be a case. But we can't rule out that the patient may have had influenza but is no longer excreting virus by the time we tested and enrolled. So those patients kind of fall into a middle category. Patients meeting enrollment criteria should be enrolled prior to receiving the clinical influenza test results. So our goal is that there was nothing about influenza testing on the enrollment criteria. We want them just to have symptoms. Once we start full enrollment where you're screening everybody in the ICU, enrolling everybody, you go ahead and do the testing, and sometimes the Marshfield testing may come back sooner than the local site testing. So you can go ahead and enroll. You don't have to have them documenting influenza testing or test results at the sites. So you basically need to obtain informed consent, complete the parent interview about vaccination history, collect the 2 appropriate respiratory specimens, and then send them to Marshfield on dry ice in the shipping boxes that Marshfield sends you. Also, you need to complete sections 1 through 5 of the ICU case report form in REDCap within 24 hours of specimen collection. The reason for this is because we need to know that you enrolled somebody and what kind of patient it is. That way we can start immediately in case the patient ends up being influenza positive, and as soon as we know the patient's influenza positive, we can match to 2 available controls. You also then follow the ICU enrollee throughout the hospital discharge and complete the remaining sections of the ICU case report form. Now, for the respiratory specimen collection, for intubated ICU enrollees, you need to collect the following: an endotracheal aspirate and a nasopharyngeal swab. The reason is we're testing them to determine what is the most sensitive method, or are they equivalent? So we're doing a comparison head-to-head, trying to get them collected within a few hours of each other so that we can make a comparison. Now, say that you can only get one test because you know, the patient is too hypoxic for you to take off the ventilator and you cannot get the endotracheal aspirate. Go ahead and enroll the patient and just send the nasopharyngeal flock swab because that's a fairly good test even on the intubated patients. And if the patient ends up being positive, we would consider them flu positive. If then later on, within 12 to 24 hours, you can get an endotracheal aspirate, you can go ahead and collect and send that as well. But our goal is to try to send these two tests around the same time so we can answer the question of which test is more sensitive, which site is more sensitive. Now for the non-intubated ICU enrollees, you need to collect the nasopharyngeal aspirate and the nasopharyngeal swab. We're making a comparison about what's the best way to test non-intubated patients. If for a certain reason you can only get one test out of those two, we recommend you do the nasopharyngeal swab if you can only get one of those two tests. But our goal is to make a comparison so that later on we can determine if the swab is actually better than the aspirate or vice versa. And so we hope that for most of the patients, people can get to both of them within hours of each other. Now, the window for collecting the respiratory specimens is less than or equal to 7 days from the onset of influenza symptoms. Now, onset of influenza symptoms can be kind of complex because especially in patients who are chronically ill and often have a lot of chronic symptoms and may have a constant cough or runny nose or have intermittent fevers. So if you have any question, please call us and someone will be available to talk with you, or we'll send the question to me and I'll talk with you about it. Because our goal is that we don't lose patients because of this criteria when it's likely that if they're really, really critically ill and it is due to influenza, that it's likely they'd still be excreting the virus. The reason this cutoff is because we don't want to get false negatives. We don't want to get a patient enrolled, we test them, it's pretty late into their course, their influenza test is negative because they're no longer excreting influenza, and then we consider them negative when they truly were positive. So all specimens are to be shipped to Marshfield real time. Do not batch ship these specimens unless they're collected on the same day. So please just go ahead, you have plenty of boxes there. You'll have shipping requirements including dry ice, and just send them that same day that you collected them. Now, some sites had trouble getting their results from Marshfield on their patients, and so we decided to make it easier for people. We'll report the Marshfield results to the sites. So Anna will be checking the Marshfield site regularly and will report the results. If you want to have access, if you want to look them up yourself, you still can. So it's not to be a barrier, it's to be just additional support. So the vaccine verification spreadsheet needs to be sent on a weekly basis to Abt. Last season, the spreadsheet was sent to Abt at the conclusion of enrollment. Now we really need this on weekly because we're going to be trying to real-time follow up those, enroll those controls. And so we need this vaccine verification spreadsheet. Both positive and negative, and also the reason is because we're going to be starting to verify the vaccination status of the enrollee who are flu positive right away. We're not going to do it all at the end of the season. We're going to start doing the verification process as soon as they're enrolled and we know that they have flu. So we have to call their primary MD or wherever they had the say they had the vaccination, or look at the state registry, vaccine registry, if that's available. using multiple methods to confirm that the patient truly was vaccinated. And now we're actually going to be confirming both positive and negative vaccine reports. So if the patient says that they were not, the patient's parent says they were not vaccinated, we will still call their PMD, primary MD, and make sure that they have no evidence of giving that patient a flu vaccination. Now, in an optimally designed case control study, controls are from a similar population as the cases. The population of interest for the controls includes patients who have similar influenza exposure risk. So the same influenza was going around their community at the same prevalence. And so that's why we pick children from the same geographical area. They also need to have a similar risk for developing critical illness. So we match them by age because we know that younger patients, at least for seasonal influenza, are at higher risk of influenza-related complications and hospitalization. And then we match them according to underlying illness category of risk. So, for example, somebody with very severe heart disease may be matched with somebody who has cancer, because both of those have high risk of having influenza complications, where somebody with mild asthma may be matched with another patient with mild asthma because they are in an intermediate risk tier. They also need to have a similar propensity to be vaccinated, which means they have access to health care. And that's the main reason we say that they had to have been seen within the hospital within the last 24 months, within a hospital within nearby. Now, the community controls from last season will be kept as a sample for this season as long as they remain eligible in the same age category. So somebody who's now 18 will not be a control for somebody who's 17. Each site then just has to supply as many additional controls as needed to meet the original sample targets in each age group influenza severity risk tier cell. So we're trying to make it easy for everybody, easier, so that they just have to give us additional patients in case they ran out of patients in that cell. So in order to do this, we need to send out opt-out continuation letters to all those patients in the registry who are still eligible, in the data set of controls who are still eligible, so that we can inform them about the study continuation for another year, because last year's letter said that we were only doing the study last year. The other thing to note is that receipt of antivirals is no longer an exclusion criteria for potential community controls. So even if they received antivirals, they could still be a community control. Now the timeline is that we gave everybody the protocol updates in August. We were hoping that they would get it through human subjects review August to September. Some people are still doing that, but we hope that everybody's pretty much already has it through their IRB or awaiting IRB approval. Most of these documents were translated into Spanish last year, but if you need help translating documents into Spanish, please notify Abt right away. They will help you with that. Then we need to get our controls, community control Excel spreadsheet repopulated, so our data set full for the community controls. We're hoping to do that last month and this month, November. And then sometime, we're not sure when we're going to trigger it, but because currently flu activity is very sporadic and low across the U.S., but at some point we'll start seeing a lot more influenza activity, and then we will trigger ICU enrollment, which will take place between the triggering date and going up through the last day of enrollment sometime in May, and then some of those patients will still be in the hospital in June and July, and so we would continue data collection. For community controls, we would do the same. As soon as we know we have a positive case, we'll start getting a community control matched and enrolled. We'll be cleaning up data sometime in the spring through the summer through July. So as soon as you enter the patient and the patient's data is complete because the patient's no longer in the ICU or in the hospital, we will start cleaning up that data. And then our final data set cleaning and analysis is August to November. So we have to get our data set to this Abt, who then puts the community control data set and the ICU data sets together and gives them de-identified to the CDC. Now, your current contract has been extended through November 30th. This extension allows you to attend the training session, submit your continuing review, and those people, this was actually for those who went to the PALISI meeting. If people from your site did go to the meeting, you should be billing Abt for that $1,000 if you've attended the training and submitting the continuing review. And please send the invoice to them as soon as possible. And Abt cannot move forward until they have official sign-up for the CDC, but we have that now, so that's not a barrier. But don't submit any data to Abt, such as your community control list, until your contract is in place. So here's the data flow. The data storage sites are at the site, so you have your own data storage at Children's Hospital Boston with the REDCap data set and at Abt. Now the data collection sites are the SRBI and the EMSI for the community controls. And then we send the vaccine verification spreadsheet to Abt and the ICU and community control consent forms to Abt. And then Abt removes these IDs and sends them to EMSI, de-identified. And the confirmed vaccine verification spreadsheet is sent to Abt as well from the site, from SRBI and EMSI. So then the sites are going to transmit their ICU report forms to Children's Boston, enter data from the ICU report form into REDCap, and then you also need to send us the, the reason we need the case report form and you to enter it in the REDCap is because we do double data entry. So we, as part of our cleanup, we take what you put on the case report form, we re-enter it, we make a comparison, and look for data entry errors. And if something is on the case report form that is discrepant from what you entered into REDCap, we'll ask you to clarify what the truth is. So that we can have a clean data set, and we did find a lot, not a huge number, but an important, could have been important number of data entry errors, as people do in all studies. So the first data analysis is going to be that primary aim for vaccine effectiveness, and then after that's all done, we'll start doing the part 2, the secondary aims. So the first data analysis, the primary aim part 1, Abt will de-identify the data sets, put it all together, transmit the completely de-identified data set to the CDC, and then that's going to be the primary aim. So once all that's done and they've done the analysis at the CDC and reported the results, then only then will we start on the secondary analyses. So this was the enrollment breakdown from last year. We had 5,142 patients screened, and then most of the patients, this many patients were not eligible, most of them because of no influenza-like illness. 348 patients were eligible, and 121 were enrolled. 227 were not enrolled, and that was a somewhat surprisingly low enrollment rate for a observational study like this, only 35% of eligible patients. Some of it was because they declined, but also some of it was because staff were unavailable or a parent was unavailable. So we're hoping, if possible this year, to get this enrollment up to 50% or higher of eligible patients, which is more reflective of usually of what you see in observational studies. So out of these enrolled, we had 30 cases. That means there were PCR influenza positive at Marshfield. 90 ICU controls that they were PCR negative and they did not have any positive influenza tests at the site. And one that was indeterminate because it was PCR positive at the site and PCR negative at Marshfield. Preliminary results as far as characteristics of the ICU enrollees showed that the ICU cases were more likely than the ICU flu negative controls to be previously healthy children and to be sicker, have acute lung injury, ARDS, and develop shock requiring vasopressors. 87% of those ICU cases received oseltamivir as they should have, compared to only 36% of the ICU controls. And by parent report, 51% of those cases, so out of those 30 cases, although this is small, only about half were vaccinated. So this is a slide to show why Marshfield testing is so important. Here we have these were at the site, the flu test was positive and how it was positive, culture, PCR, DFA, rapid. So basically we got 6 additional positives using Marshfield very sensitive testing. And one of them was from culture, 3 of them were PCR. So it's even more sensitive than the PCR test used at the sites. It's not surprising that it's more sensitive than the direct fluorescent antibody test. And there are some false positive rapid tests, and we've known that for a while. So there was 2 cases where the rapid test at the site was positive, but only, and it was negative at Marshfield. So now when they're negative at the site, we had that they were negative 143 patients, but only 137 were Marshfield negative because it had more positives. But there was some discrepancy there that the DFA said negative, but 4 of them were actually positive. So these are the discrepancies here. And also there was 5 that were inconclusive at the site. Now, looking at where you collected the specimen from and a comparison for influenza A, the NP swab and the nasal pharyngeal flock swab versus the aspirate were about the same. For influenza B, the swab and the aspirate were also about the same, but there was only a small number that were flu positive. And then for influenza A, when you looked at intubated patients, there was 1 patient where the swab was actually more sensitive, was positive, and the aspirate was not. And for influenza B, the same occurred. So it's possible that the NP swab may, on intubated patients, even be a better test. So that's one of the things that we're trying to test in that study, though. So please try to collect as many as you can simultaneous or within a couple of hours an endotracheal aspirate specimen and a flock swab specimen so that we can make this important comparison. So it's very important that we keep up the persistence and be diligent in screening and enrolling all eligible patients. And during that peak time of enrollment of flu season, which is usually in February, and a little bit into March and sometimes late January, to try to enroll on those 4 or 5 Saturdays to try to meet our enrollment targets. Moving into the season, we also want to make sure, just learning from what last year, that we ensure the integrity of the specimens. We ship in real time. We don't batch ship them unless they're all collected on the same day. We don't want there to be delays in you collecting the specimen and us receiving them. Always email Marshfield upon shipment so that somebody's available to receive the package. Now this is an issue that sometimes people shipped on a Friday, didn't tell Marshfield, and it was sitting on their loading dock with the dry ice melting. So just to be extra careful and so that it never happens, let Marshfield know that you're shipping them something so that they know to collect it, especially if you're shipping on a Friday. And closely monitor your supply of specimen collection kits. If you're running low, alert Marshfield right away because we don't want you having eligible patients and not having kits. Make sure that you fill out those ICU report forms and REDCap in real time. Very, very, very minor changes were made to this season's ICU report forms, mainly to make sure that the REDCap and the paper form were exactly identical. And make sure you fill out sections 1 through 5 of the ICU report form in REDCap within 24 hours of enrolling a patient so that we can tier them accurately as to what their risk of influenza was. And when you upload the completed ICU report forms, please make sure that they match the data in REDCap. Okay, so if you do a check yourself on what you entered into REDCap and do kind of a visual second check, that although we will catch any data entry errors, you know, if you catch them yourself, then we don't have to send you a list of things to fix. Send in your ICU screening log, which is the denominator. We really need to know how many patients were eligible, or how many patients total were in the ICU and were screened and eligible but not enrolled. We really need that, or our paper won't be able to be published in a high-quality journal. And during the peak season, send it for the previous week every Monday to Children's Hospital Boston study staff. And that's the end of my presentation, and I'll take any questions now that you may have.
If people have questions, I think the best way to do this would be to raise your hand or to type in the question. That way we won't get too much feedback by unmuting anybody. So if you could please raise your hand, I will unmute you then.
Do people know how to raise their hands?
I think so. There's a little icon that looks like a hand. You just we have a question from Teresa Wilson. Teresa, you're unmuted. Can you hear us?
Yes. My question is about the community controls. Are we going to get feedback from the controls that they have from last year so we can just add to that, or how do we go about with that?
Are you going to get, yes, so on those community controls, yes, they're going to send you a list. And Bethany, Bethany's actually going to go over the community controls for the next presentation in detail, but basically they're going to send you a list of everybody who is still eligible and not eligible. Those who are not eligible, we want you to get rid of their data. And those who are eligible will be on the spreadsheet, and then we need you to then send them immediately a letter notifying them of their option to opt out, given that we're extending it for another year, letting them know we extended for another year. And then you'll only need to recruit additional controls to fill the cells of the ones that were used or the ones that aged out of the study.
Right. Okay. So we will still receive that.
What?
We will receive that shortly then.
Yes, I thought that they had already sent out the list. It could be that your contract is not. I'm not sure. Bethany, didn't all the lists were already sent out, weren't they?
Hey, Adrienne, this is Beth. I'm going to go over the community controls after Adrienne, but yes, we sent out the list to the site so they could get started. What site are you from? I'm not sure I caught that in the beginning.
Children's Colorado.
Okay.
Colorado.
Yeah, I can connect with you after the call, after the webinar.
Okay.
And
Okay.
we can talk offline.
No, I think the problem here for you is that it went to the main, what, Valerie?
Yeah. Yeah.
So Valerie should have that list.
Okay. Last week she said she didn't, but maybe she did get it in the meantime. Okay. Thank
Well, we'll
you.
check. We'll follow up with you. You should have the list by now.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Beth.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Or
Yes, we can. Yep.
okay. Let me just.
You're all set.
Okay, great. Hi everyone. I'm Beth Brennan. I'm sure Either you know me from last season or have seen or received some emails from me in the past few months about this upcoming season. Today I'm going to go over the community control, recruitment, identification process, your control tracker, some post-enrollment activities. We have this optional vaccine verification that Adrian touched upon. I'll go into some more detail about that. And then we revamped our SFTP, our Secure File Transfer Portal, with a new layout. It was a bit cumbersome last year where each site had their own individual folder, and since sites were uploading PHI, we had to have all the folders disabled, and you would need to call Abt beforehand to get access to the folder to upload. So we've changed that a bit, hopefully to reduce the amount of back and forth between Abt and the sites. I'll do a quick run through of it. We're still testing it, but plan to have it up in the next week or so, and I'll send out some instructions as to how to access and navigate the site. And then I'll take any questions at the end. So this is a bit scary, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview of the whole community control recruitment and enrollment process. And I broke it down into 3 parts here. So sites are required to compile a list of 210 community controls from medical records. You'd mail out the opt-out letters. This year we have 2 different sets of opt-out letters. I'll go into that in more detail in a moment. Once the opt-out period lapses, you remove the opt-outs from your list of controls and the return to senders. So since these people never actually had the chance to opt out, since they never received the letter, we need to remove them from the list. And then if you have IRB approval and your contract is signed with Abt and at your own site, then you can go ahead and upload your control list to the Abt SFTP. And it circulates back until the 15-cell enrollment distribution table is complete and 210 controls have been provided. So an ICU case positive is enrolled. We have your control list, and SRBI, our survey team, randomly selects 8 matched controls. You might ask, why do we select 8 children from the list to complete 2 interviews? Now, you know, we recruit 2 controls per 1 case positive, and our survey team says it takes about 4 controls from the sample to complete 1 interview, so that's why we select 8 matched controls. So they contact these children. They either refuse, they can't contact them, they remove them from the list, or they're unmatched by severity tier. So the survey team goes through a series of screening questions and asks the parent about the medical conditions and any underlying conditions. And if the algorithm calculates a different severity risk tier than the tier that you gave us in the control tracker, this patient would not be eligible to be matched to the case reference, to the match case reference for this particular control. We do ask the parent if we can put them back in the queue for future enrollment. The parent says yes, then we put them back in the queue. Otherwise, we remove them from the list. SRBI completes the 2 interviews for 1 case. They send the consent form to the control with a $25 gift card. They'll follow up and possibly exhaust the protocol. There's a protocol for how many times they can actually call an enrolled control for the signed consent form. Hopefully the control returns the signed consent form, and then we go ahead and send an additional $25 gift card to close out the control. It's important to remember that if the control does not return the signed consent form, then we don't have permission to contact the control's vaccine provider or primary care provider about their vaccine status. This year we're going to be verifying vaccination for children who were and were not, or reported being or being not vaccinated with the 2011-2012 vaccination or vaccine. And if we don't receive the control consent form signed, we also cannot have sites send us their medical record detailed health information. So I just wanted to give you a little background about the 8 matched controls per case. Last year, SRBI dialed 435 numbers that sites gave us in their control lists. And out of those 378, about 87% were good numbers, meaning an answering machine or phone number, somebody answered. It wasn't, this number cannot be dialed or it's been disconnected. They made contacts with 84%. That includes answering machines. They screened 190 contacts and they completed 78. So only 18% of the total number dialed were actually successful completed interviews. So it's important that when you're putting your list together, and I'm going to go over using some of the controls from last year's sample, that maybe you look to see if there are updated phone numbers or contact information for controls, since this information can change in a year's time. So I'll go over some of that in more detail in a bit. So for the upcoming flu season, we have, what I've done is I've gone over with our survey team to identify which children from your sample that you provided last year are still eligible to participate in the study for this flu season. So that means they weren't enrolled last year, or they hadn't refused participation. They hadn't opted out last year. They haven't aged out, so they're within 6 months and 17 years old. And they've been seen at your PALISI site since 9/109. So one of the exclusion criteria is that controls are seen at the PALISI site within the last 24 months. So we're using 9/109 as the cutoff. I've sent out the list of controls that are still eligible at their sites, along with the cell distribution table, to let you know which children of which age category and severity risk tier still need to be recruited for this coming year to fill the cells. Once you get this table, you'll be able to proposively identify the additional sample for replenishment. We suggest that, or you may wish to identify more than 210 potential controls. Sometimes we exhaust one of the age categories and severity risk tiers just from, by chance bad numbers, and then we have to come back to you for additional controls, where then you would send out the opt-out letters again, wait for the opt-out period to lapse, send us the controls, and then we go ahead and try to complete the interview. If you provide more than 210 controls ahead of time, sometimes we're able to avoid this process, but you are only required to provide 210 controls in total for the 2 years. So the site targets are the same from last year. As you should know, all of the infants have now aged into the toddler group, so those 24 controls will need to be replenished for next year. So here are the age groups. This is in the protocol, and then the severity risk tiers as well. The tracker calculates the severity risk tier for you as well as the age group, and I can give you a little bit of an example here. These are fake names. I completed the first 10, I guess, or 11. You're going to complete this list of site community controls. This is the only sheet in the tracker you actually entered data into. We're asking that you put the age of the patient in column I. We'd like to calculate the age and gender of community controls who've opted out. So, for instance, row 7 and row 13, I hypothetically had these rows opt out, and so I went in and removed all the data for these people and then put in their age here. So you're going to complete the control tracker exactly as you had last year. And you'll go over here, and then you have these 3 tables again. This is what I sent you, this blue table here that shows how many children or controls you need to identify for the upcoming year. So obviously we have 24 infants that need to be replenished. And then depending on your list that I received from SRBI, calculating their age and severity risk tier, 66 total controls. This is a hypothetical example. So you'll see at the bottom table, as you complete or fill out this tab, the bottom table becomes completed. And then the data sent to Abt SRBI automatically populates over here. This is the tab that's sent to SRBI only, not the entire spreadsheet, and I can go over how to send that and prepare that for SRBI in a moment. Okay. So some site inputs: child and parent names, contact info, zip, child date of birth. Obviously you want to make sure the child is eligible for the study, so you want to fill out the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and you'll go into the child medical conditions with a yes/no. It automatically calculates the severity tier for you, and then tracking information for opt-out processes. So that's the date of birth and gender of those children who opted out of the study. The tracker automatically generates for sites the age group, severity risk tier for each entry, counts the number of targets remaining to fill in each cell. We have the tab that's sent to SRBI, which is the limited data. It doesn't give any detailed health information. It merely gives the patient's name, contact information of the parents, the date of birth, the age category, and severity risk tier. And then at the end, obviously, if the child has provided a signed consent form, then this would be the complete data set for the detailed medical conditions. And that's only for those children that have participated in the study and sent back a signed consent form. So completing the control tracker, I just went over this. You're going to use the age group severity risk table. It's the blue table that I sent to you with your trackers for this year. And then you'll go ahead and identify additional controls to fill those cells. You're going to send out 2 different opt-out letters. So when I sent you the list of your new tracker for this year and the table that shows how it needs to be replenished for this coming year, I also sent you a list of children who are still eligible from your sample last year. For those children that are still eligible, you don't need to put them in a control tracker. What you'll do is send a continuation opt-out letter to them. The opt-out letter from last year said that we would contact them through the summer of 2011. So we need to send out another opt-out letter to let these children and parents know that the study is continuing. So this is what the purpose of this letter will say. You know, the study's continued another year. If you'd like, you can opt out, and it would give these children who are eligible for the coming year to opt out of the study if they didn't opt out last year. For the newly identified controls, you're going to send out a 2011-2012 season opt-out letter, which is basically the same as the one from last year, but with updated information. It's going to introduce the study and provide an opportunity for these newly identified controls to opt out of being called to participate in the study. You'll wait for the opt-out period to lapse, which is about 2 to 4 weeks based on, you know, the site's individual IRB regulations. It's important to note that the continuation opt-out letter should be sent as soon as possible. So one of the sites has already sent out their continuation opt-out letters. They have IRB approval, and their contract has been signed with Abt. So while they identify the new controls to fill their community control tracker for the 210, they sent the continuation opt-out letters to their control sample from last year that are still eligible for this year. So say flu started tomorrow and we enrolled a case positive in this geographic catchment area, we'd already have, well, if the opt-out period had lapsed, we'd already have some control sample to call. So it's important that the continuation opt-out letters go out as soon as possible. So you wait for the opt-out letters to the opt-out period to lapse, and then you want to remove the children, but before you do, you want to collect the age and gender of the opt-outs. What you want to do if you received opt-outs received after the opt-out deadline is lapsed and you've uploaded your control tracker, you want to send the study ID only from your tracker to me in an email. And what I do is I forward that to the survey team and ask them to remove that child from their list, so that child will not be called. You want to save and upload the tracker to the Abt SFTP. Given you haven't already done so, I can show you how to do this. This is where you enter all your information. This is where you identify what information you have left to enter. This is the information that goes to Abt SRBI. You want to highlight, select all up here in the corner. You can do a Control A. And you want to copy this, open a new document. If you do File, Paste Special, you want it to look pretty, you can put the formats in. But really, you just want to put the values in here. Okay? The reason we do this is because if you upload the entire community control tracker, we actually have the detailed health information for the children, for the children that you've entered here, and this is information that is not authorized to be sent to our survey team. So we only need this information, and you would save it somewhere safe and secure. I'm going to save it to my desktop. That's probably not a safe and secure place, but this is just for testing purposes. And you can save it, return to Abt, SRBI. You want to put your site name and the date. You don't have to put the date, but I like putting the date in my file names. And this is the file that you'll send and upload to SRBI. Okay. All right. There's directions on how to do this in the training binder. Feel free to give me a call if you're struggling or having problems with it. I'm happy to walk you through it over the phone. Please don't send it to me. I cannot see it or look at it. So if you're having trouble, just give me a call and we can walk through it together. Okay, so some post-enrollment activities. You provided this information to me this past year. If you're new to the study, we asked for detailed medical conditions. So this first tab that we never get because you don't send it to us. You only send us this tab. So we ask for this tab here from you for those patients or controls who enrolled in the study and that we received a signed consent form. So you'll go in and you'll to your original tracker and you'll save it as a new tracker, a new file. Maybe you'd call it detailed medical conditions, and I can go over this with you when the time comes. This isn't due until enrollment ends, which is after April of next year. But you could go in and say these people never enrolled in the study. You could delete them out here. You know, you'd save this as a new file so you wouldn't really be messing with your original list of control trackers. Say these are the children that enrolled and that we received a consent form from. You could save this as detailed medical conditions and upload that to the Abt SFTP site. As Adrian mentioned, we have an optional vaccine verification, on-site vaccine verification. Last year we came across some instances where our contractor, EMSI, who was verifying vaccinations for children, couldn't access or couldn't obtain a health record from a provider or from the state registry. And we noticed that some of these children had been vaccinated on site at the PALISI site. So we contacted the PALISI site and asked them if they'd be willing to look in the child's medical record and verify the vaccination for us. So going forward, the standard protocol is going to remain the same in that EMSI, they'll download the vaccine information that I upload to them on a weekly basis once flu season is active. And they'll contact the provider for vaccination. If they cannot get the vaccination record from the provider, they'll contact the state registry. If the child has been, if they're not having any luck with the vaccination registry and the child's been vaccinated at the PALISI site, then I'll come to the study coordinator and ask if you would go ahead and verify the vaccination on site. Some of the vaccine information collected will be the number of doses, the date of the vaccine, or the dates of the vaccine if there's more than one dose, the type of vaccination and the vaccine manufacturer. You'll be compensated $70 per verification attempt. Some stats from last year, we had 3 sites that did online on-site vaccine verifications. This is for the pilot phase only. 33 attempted verifications, 18% site-verified vaccinations. So it helped us get 20% of the verifications, which is extremely helpful. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the data transfer site is changing a bit. I will be sending out, new instructions, updated instructions. But basically, everyone is going to log into a PALISI default homepage here, where you'll have 6 folders. You're going to upload the control detailed medical conditions here. That won't happen until the spring. You're going to upload your control tracker here. The ICU report forms you're going to upload here. This is so we can do double data entry for data verification purposes. ICU enrollee consent forms, we need this just as a standard of practice. You'll upload those there. On-site vaccine verification, you'll download any information I've sent to you. You'll upload the information that you find in the vaccine verification here if we don't already talk about it over the phone. And then any other documents, you'll have your own site folder here. This is a test site for Atlanta. And this is a place where Abt and sites can easily transfer data between one another without the other sites having access to the same folder. So the first five folders the sites will have the same access to, but you'll only be able to upload to them. So if you upload something in the detailed medical conditions, the sites can only see that there's a file in there. They actually can't download the file. I think this is going to really decrease the number of traffic and the number of time it takes for study coordinators to upload when they're ready and calling Abt. I'm going to send out some instructions in the next week. This is being tested for QA and QC, and it should be easier going forward. There might be some hiccups, but hopefully it should be pretty smooth given that this is the second year. People are familiar with the site, and it's much more easy than having to have Abt go in and disable and enable folders every time a site wants to upload something. And that's all. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, you can give me a call anytime or after the webinar. I'd be happy to chat with you.
These are from Teresa Doxum, who's the Abt IRB administrator. And I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware that the HIPAA guidelines are now, much tighter, and this study we're accessing data from a lot of patients, the community controls, for example, that prior to consent we're getting their data, then we're sending them letters to opt out. This has been a very carefully designed study, but it's really important that we make sure that we adhere to all the patient privacy rules. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the Abt IRB and the local IRBs, coordinating the IRB paperwork, the IRB's role in protecting confidentiality, a little bit of overview of the new HIPAA and high-tech rule changes, what deviations there were last year from data security procedures, and some tips, do's and don'ts, and then how do you report if there's an incident. So Abt IRB reviews the master study protocol, continuing review, and ensures each local IRB provides continuing approval. They have to first review, approve any updates to the master study protocol, prospectively review any subsequent modifications, track adverse events, unanticipated problems and deviations from the protocol, and field complaints from the community control participants. So because Abt is managing that whole community control piece, if there's a complaint from a participant there, it would go directly to Abt. The local IRBs, privacy boards, and HIPAA experts will review the local study protocol. Now, each site may have had to make some minor changes to meet their own local IRB regulations, including their consent form, HIPAA authorization agreements, which at each site can be a little bit different because of site rules. And then they will indicate if updates are needed for HIPAA data use agreement to share the personal health identifiers with Abt or Abt SRBI, receive reports of adverse events, unanticipated problems, and deviations from the protocol for the ICU patients, as well as if there is something on a community control at that site, and field calls, complaints, concerns from the ICU participants. So for year 2, the Abt IRB, they already approved the overall study in September, and now we need the local IRB approvals. They already approved all modifications, and then they'll review any updates needed with the Abt contract operations for data use agreements. So breach of confidentiality is one of the main risks to human subjects, and IRBs are required to review the adequacy of provisions to maintain confidentiality. And confidentiality really means the treatment of information that an individual has disclosed in a relationship of trust and with the expectation that it won't be divulged to others in ways that are inconsistent with the understanding of the original disclosure without permission. So these are patients who are trusting that we will protect their confidentiality. And the level of confidentiality protections have to be in line with the potential risk of harm. Because we know confidential medical information and social information about the family, we have to be careful that we protect that information. So the Abt IRB and the Information Technology, Information Security team works with the Abt Study team and research partners like the PALISI Network to identify the data security procedures that balance protections needed with the burden and feasibility for study teams. Now the key regulations driving the data security procedures for this study are the HIPAA issues, and there's a link there that hopefully we can get you these slides so that you can click on these links. I think it would be good for us to send all the sites, all the training sites if you don't have them already. And so you can read all the different issues from that. That's the NIH site for the HIPAA rule. The Health and Human Services has this new High-Tech Act, which increased authority for enforcement of HIPAA. So now there's millions of dollars in fines when there's HIPAA breaches, and sites can actually stop receiving money from the government for research. All research can be put on hold if a major medical institution has been found to be breaching HIPAA. There's a mandatory media notification and website posting if over 500 individuals are affected, and if you go to that link, you can see that there's sites, some of them even may be sites in PALISI that have been affected, or hospitals. Maybe none of the PALISI studies that I know specifically, but if a hospital is affected, there's this website posting that they have to do. So a breach is an impermissible use or disclosure under the privacy rule that compromises the security or privacy of the protected health information such that the use or disclosure poses a significant risk of financial, reputational, or other harm to the affected individual. So if somebody leaves their laptop and it's unencrypted with the names and diagnoses and like, for example, that whole control list or a bunch of case report forms with the patient's names on there, on the bus or on your laptop, and your laptop's left somewhere, and somebody takes it, then that is a breach of security. So it's important if you do use portable devices, including thumb drives or laptops, that they're encrypted. if you keep the patient information on it. And it's very important that when you're using paper that you make sure that you put it in the appropriate discard places, such as a shredder, and that when you're managing your study data, that you're keeping it in locked cabinets, the paper forms, and that you're not leaving them out on desks and other places where that patient information could be seen. So high-tech requirements, if there is a breach, they have to report, if it affects more than 500 people, it has to be reported within 60 days. And it has to be reported annually if it's less than 500 people. And there's fines of up to $1.5 million per major breach. Now, last year we had some minor deviations. We did not have any breaches of data security. Some of the minor deviations are that the reason that Beth went through all of those community control, how to do that in detail, is because we're trying to control how much data you send SRBI and you send out of your institution without consent or without giving the patient time to opt out. So we don't want all that detailed medical conditions, and you should have removed all of that, and you keep it at your site. But what you send Abt is a restricted list, a bit of data, just enough for them to contact the patient and get consent, as well as a tiering, so they can figure out which patient to contact. So the other thing that sometimes that happened a couple of times were, you have like the medical record number sticker, and sometimes that has the social security number. And so if you do all that and you put it on the consent before you upload the consent to us, then that's information that we should not have had. So just make sure that whatever you're sending information over to Abt or over to Children's Hospital Boston on the ICU patients or on the community controls to Abt, that you are making sure you're only sending the minimal amount of data needed and requested, and you're not sending any additional information. The other thing is, don't send around stuff on the web via email. We have a very secure upload web portal site to make sure that everything is secure before you upload it. And so please use the FTP sites. Please follow all of the guidelines, and if there are any questions and you want somebody to walk you through your upload or go over things verbally, do not hesitate to ask, because Beth is more than willing to talk to anybody who needs her and to walk you through this process as you do it if you feel that would be helpful. So the other things that are important is to update your HIPAA training. HIPAA rules change. They're getting more and more tighter with more regulations. Know your own institution's data security policies for personal health information and social security numbers, etc. Follow the data security plan contained in the study's IRB protocol, and make sure that you read the fine print in data use agreements. And go ahead and ask questions. That's the most important thing, is to make sure that you're informed. So remember to make sure you're only doing, when you're in this study, we've pretty much identified what is the minimum necessary data, the personal health identifiers that we need in order to accomplish the task. We're only asking you to send the minimum necessary. And please, don't send more than needed, because that could lead to a data security problem. Make sure that you submit it, securely transmit it. Don't be sending it as an email attachment. Now, unless you have a secure email methodology in your institution, don't send it outside of your institution as an email attachment. Make sure you shred paper copies and don't throw them in the general trash. sure that you store paper copies in locked cabinets, store things on a secure, password-protected server, and develop a plan for sharing data that complies with the HIPAA authorizations, which we already have this very detailed data security plan that took a long time to develop and was checked by multiple IRBs as well as the Abt IRB. And so, you know, please follow the data security plan. Now, as far as reporting, if something does happen, just let people know. I mean, when things happen, it's important to minimize the potential damage by notifying the local IRB and the HIPAA privacy officer of any adverse events, protocol deviations as far as data security, breaches of confidentiality, or serious participant complaints. And then the IRBs at your site and the HIPAA privacy officers will determine how to classify the incident. Also notify Anna and Lauren Olshow from the Abt and Anna of Children's Hospital Boston so that we can follow up with if there's any unanticipated problems. And please err on the side of over-reporting, because frequently, as happened with the community control list, it's where we identified that people are having the same, making a same mistake and having the same problem, and then we could put in things, implement quickly things to fix the problem or to prevent it from happening again. Communication with IRBs should always flow through the institution study representatives, the local PIs, Anna from Children's Hospital Boston, Lauren Olshow, rather than directly between IRBs. So your IRB should not be sending things out to all the study IRBs. That is the responsibility of the Abt IRB and the study representatives. You just have to deal with your own site. The CDC gets copies of IRB unanticipated event reports. And Teresa Doxham at Abt is the head of their IRB. She's really, really helpful. She loves to talk to people, and if anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to contact her as well. But if we were hoping that you would go ahead and try to contact Lauren first to let her know that you're contacting Teresa. But if you need to talk to Teresa, she's also available. So that is an overview of the HIPAA privacy rules. Does anybody have any questions? Hello?
This is Bethany. I don't see any questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand or do a question, comment.
Okay, if so, then if any questions do come up about anything that was covered, do not hesitate to email Anna, or if it has to do with the community controls, email Lauren. And thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate the time that you took coming to the webinar, and we hope that it was helpful.